first of all, while Shashwat is busy, uh, let me tell you a little bit what reserve currencies are. Um, Today, it's a pretty familiar concept, and let me tell you a little bit about an incident that happened to me while I was walking around in Moscow. I just left my very fancy hotel, paid by somebody else, and there was a sign at the cashier window that said, "You can only pay in rubles here," or something. And that contrasted very sharply with the young lady who accosted me outside the hotel and who offered me various sorts of services, but wished to be paid exclusively in US dollars. And here you have an illustration between a local currency, a currency that is accepted in the country of origin, and a reserve currency, a currency that is basically accepted in many countries, if not just about everywhere except in North Korea. Today, we have such a situation and it is normal, but it was not always normal. So I'm going to show you coins, lots of coins, but my basic objective will be to guide you through the history of the concept of reserve currencies. And among numismatists, it is quite common to think that the first one was the peso. It wasn't. It is also quite common for people living now to think that the dollar is going to be the last reserve currency. It won't be. That is some of the message that I have for you today. Next, please. So we'll have a look at how the concept of a reserve currency came about. Then go to what was really the first reserve currency. It was a Portuguese coin, and Portugal was a discovering country just like Spain was, but in a very different way. The Spanish would just equip a ship, send it out, see if it ever comes back. That happened to Columbus, for instance. Portuguese, by contrast, were going as far as they dared, might make careful documentation, then return, then send out another ship that would go to that same point and then venture a little bit further and make documentation. That Portuguese approach proved to be much more successful. In Spain, we have an enormous amount of silver that has to go somewhere. And at the same time, Spain acquired a very bad name in that period. So how does the bad name and the good silver go together? Next was Netherlands, where Protestantism came with a different sort of moral, and trade made that there were far more countries that could actually use Dutch coins. The Dutch coins were succeeded by France, which was all the fault of Napoleon, and we'll come to see why that is, which in time, very quickly actually, was succeeded by the coins of Great Britain, where the basis of the importance of the pound was a global empire. Then, of course, we have to mention the United States, which built an enormous international alliance, a global alliance, also had a dominating economy on the world scene, and therefore could actually maintain a reserve currency with all its advantages and duties. And we'll end up with CBDC, and I'm not going to tell you much about it, except that it is money that you will never see because it is virtual and it lives in the cloud. And the IT guys among you, as well as the people who are at ease using computers, will know that the cloud is not just any cloud, and it's certainly not up in the sky. Next, please. This beautiful picture of a man digging a hole in the ground, which is my definition of a laborer, is how the concept of a reserve currency was born. What the man has in the pots is money. It is not just any money, it is silver money and gold money, because that is the basis of what the money is worth. And so this man is rich, and still he has to dig holes in the ground because the concept of the bank had not been advanced all that far. There were some monasteries, some temples that would take that functions, but in how far could you trust them? And then digging a hole in the ground was the solution. For individuals, at least, states did not have that choice. They had to remelt all the coins that came in and stamp them again in order to make money at home. Those that were not remelted and reminted went by weight. And as states always took a fee for making the coins, that meant a loss of value for the coin. Some of these coins were more successful than others, and therefore they were imitated. A very good example from the 100 Years' War, the sterling, a small silver coin, contained just a little bit more silver than the comparable silver coins of the kings of France. And so all over the area of the 100 Years' Wars, sterling was preferred to French money. And of course, the only ones who could provide sterling were the English, which made the 100 Years' Wars, well, maybe not 100 years, but a lot longer than many other wars. On the one hand, you could say that that is immoral because people trust that sterling will always have a little bit more silver than the comparable French coin, and you are therefore profiting from the trust in the foreign coin. And you can see that very clearly with local feudal lords who were imitating sterling and not bothering very much with the silver content, to put it nicely. There's also a legitimate answer. There is a need for these coins, and with the need comes economic efficiency, and with economic efficiency comes growth. Growth is good, and therefore this is the thing to do. One more note is that at this point in time, the state is not a government with a mandate as it is now. It is private property that can be inherited, it can be divided, it can be bought and sold, and that is an element of insecurity where that makes that every local coin remains a local coin. You never know what's going to happen to the issuer. Next, please. And so we start with Portugal. The coin you saw on the introductory screen, and you'll see it again, is a Portuguese coin. When Portugal started its discovery, gold was typically stuff that came out of Africa. It had to go across the Sahara Desert, it had to be shipped across the Mediterranean, and that route was very expensive, but it was also very vulnerable. You had pirates at sea, you had robbers on land, and just being in the hands of foreigners was a risk factor by itself. In comes Henry the Navigator, a Portuguese prince who was interested in discovery, was also interested in discovering ports on the African coast, which he did, and he discovered that that is where the gold was could be shipped from. So rather than buying it from the merchant adventurers who crossed the Mediterranean, he started buying gold from the Africans themselves at the Gold Coast ports. This explains why an enormous amount of gold was coming to Portugal, not to stay there, Portugal couldn't finance that. But in order to be sold again to other countries that needed gold in order to trade or wage war. Now, in 1454, Burgundy, which was a rising power, announced a plan for a crusade to retake Constantinople from the heretics. Wait a minute, Constantinople? Yeah, because there were Greek Catholics there, and Roman Catholics decided that Greek Catholics were heretics. Okay. 1457, the kings of Portugal decided that they would join that crusade, and to finance it, because they were sitting on a mountain of gold, they issued a new coin called the cruzado. Cruzado is a bit of a pun. It's it means something like the crossed one, and it could refer to the crusaders who wore a cross, or it could refer to the coin which also wore a cross. In 1481, Portugal had gone inland enough to control the gold mines of Guinea, and the amount of gold was even increasing. In 1498, Vasco da Gama went around the Cape of Good Hope in this movement of going ever further. And in this way, he opened up a trade route between South and Southeast Asia and Southwestern Europe. Therefore, in 1555, it was possible to issue the Cruzado of 500 reis, which was a very stable gold coin. It contained the same amount of gold all through the years. Didn't take that long for the coin because there was a succession crisis in Portugal in 1580, and the King of Spain, Philip II, used that particular crisis in order to take Portugal and make it part of his ever-growing empire. Next, please. And that empire, the Spanish Empire, oh, here's the coin again. This time the legends are red. On one hand, it's in Latin, of course, and on the obverse it says Cruzatus Alfonsi Quinti Regis Portugalis. Therefore, this is a Cruzado of Alfonso, the fifth king of Portugal. Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domine. Hear us in the name of God. Well, people heard, not in the name of God, but in the name of gold. Next, please. And with the Portuguese competition out of the competition, Spain had it easy, but they also had a bit of good luck. The good luck was the pragmatic of Medina del Campo, which was basically a decree, a royal decree that said, okay, we'll have new coins now. And they set forth the denominations, how much the denominations were worth in terms of each other. In other words, how many reales would go into gold coin, or how many copper coins you would need to buy a silver coin, and where they would be struck. That pragmatic could actually be maintained for a very long time, as long as silver is concerned, because of a large inflow of silver. And the silver inflow was made possible to a large extent by the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between Spanish and Portuguese influence. The whole thing was promoted by the Pope, and therefore it couldn't be wrong. Spain was getting the eastern part of South America, basically South America minus Brazil. Portugal was given the rest, in other words, more or less Brazil, and that went all the way to Japan. You can imagine that the Japanese were not pleased when they heard that they came under Portuguese influence. So once they really had enough of the priests coming in, they killed most of them, and they were pretty cruel about it. The only survivors were the Dutch, because they could tell the officials that they were not Catholic in any way; they were Protestant, and therefore they were the ones who were allowed to continue the trade with Japan. But that's not where the silver was. The silver was in the Americas, and from there it had to be brought to Spain, and that was not easy. The Habsburgs were at war against just about all their neighbors, the Grand Dukes, no, at the time Dukes of Savoy, because they thought that Milan should really be Spanish. The Bourbons, because of domination of Europe. The Republic, which is a short phrase for the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, because they had inherited Netherlands from their ancestors, and they were rebelling, and the Habsburgs didn't appreciate that. The Tudors, of course, heretics that had to be brought back into the Catholic fold, and of course the Osmanli for the same sort of quasi-religious reasons. Now, the Spaniards did something that was of real importance, which was that they levied import taxes on imported silver, where the tax was lower on minted silver than on unminted silver. And of course, that meant that you had all these mints being set up in the Americas, and they were going to make coins, because that way they could evade a little bit of tax. So enormous amounts of silver came in, which means inflation, and there was a need to keep the silver coins, the value of the silver coins, as stable as possible. Now, there's only one way to do that, which is to change your calculation of what a copper coin is worth. And the copper coins were sloppily struck in the first place, but they were being devalued all the time. That went on for centuries. I'm going to show you some coins from different centuries, different types. And it ended only after the Napoleonic Wars, when Spain lost all its colonies in the Americas. And coincidentally, but the silver mines were getting a bit depleted at that time as well. They didn't last long after independence. Next, please. So here are some of these silver coins. They probably look familiar to you until you look a little bit closer. The first one, the Lima 1577, they're all pesos. They're all 8 reales coins. This is the same as a Spanish coin, and except for the mint mark, it could not be distinguished from a Spanish coin, which was all very well, but it had the Spanish mints complaining that most of these coins were looking far worse than this one, and they didn't want to be compared with them. So there was a separate colonial type, and it is shown on the coin of Potosi in 1672, where you have the coat of arms of Spain represented in a different way, and the decorated cross is replaced by a number of symbols, like the 2 pillars that represent the Straits of Gibraltar and the sea. This type was developed on some of the coins. I must say, you don't see more than a couple of letters of the legend plus ultra that you see in the middle line, and frankly, the whole thing looked really, really bad. But there were, in fact, not so much coins as they were silver bars. But in war zones, like in the Netherlands, they could be used unchanged, and they're still being found by metal detectorists in bad state or not bad state. The whole body that contained them is lost, and the only thing that's that is still can still be found in the ground is some silver or some other metal parts. Mints were mechanized, which meant an enormous improvement. And you see the coin of Zacatecas, which is struck by on a mechanized mint. Even those mechanized types are not always very good, but at least there is a vast improvement from the earlier types. And these coins especially were very wildly popular in other countries and available over the world, accepted all over the world. So you see a Mexico City peso that is just covered by chop marks, uh, which is a little bit like the banker's marks that you see in Indian coins, in the sense that you have family names, you have good luck signs, you also have marks like silver or real silver, genuine silver, good silver, etc. Next, please. So with the Spanish on their way out, they have left a wide variety of other coins as well. You have an escudo, a gold coin, which is worth, if I remember correctly, 8 pesos. From Sevilla here. It's a Spanish coin, but it was also widely accepted. The problem with gold coins was that the gold mines in the Americas were exhausted quite quickly. The doubloon that's below that is a similar coin, which is this one is from Madrid, but they were also struck in the colonies. They were also used in international trade and quite acceptable. You will find that the pistola is a coin that is often mentioned by Shakespeare as being in the possession of one of his bad characters. The great sufferer in all this is the colonial, is the home copper. The home copper is represented here by an 8 maravedi, which was overstruck over a 4 maravedi. In other words, it has been depreciated by 50% in 1641. The last one is just an example of how bad these things could become. Here's a 1 real, and you can see that there's the plus ultra legend is reduced to 4 letters, and below you have 2 figures of the date. It's been reduced to a quarter of its original weight. The mint is either Potosi or Lima. I can no longer find the appropriate mint marks. Next, please. And the successor to the Spaniards were the Dutch. They got their wealth not from mining and not from shipping, they got it from trading. That is remarkable in the sense that that was not a normal source of income for states at the time. One of the great traders was, of course, the United East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, VOC. You will find them anywhere from Africa to Asia, but not in the Americas, where because of treaty obligations they were forbidden, and therefore there was another trader, the West Indian Company, that took care of that trade. And these two companies had powers that you would normally expect to find with states. For instance, they could conclude treaties with foreign powers, and they could also mint coins, and they did so. There were conditions. They had to separate the coins very strictly from the coins in circulation in the Netherlands. So you can ask yourself if the VOC coins were actually Dutch. They were forbidden to circulate in the Netherlands. Nevertheless, metal detectorists find them from time to time. They may have been souvenirs of sailors, or they may just have been accepted because, well, they were there. And the reason why, especially the United East India Company got as rich as it got, was that there was a trade to be discovered in Asia. In Asia, both in India, in Japan, and in China, there was a system of a relation between gold and silver that was determined by the ruler. If the emperor of China said, you need so many strings to buy so much of gold, then that was it. But in European countries, there was more or less of a gold and silver market, and you could express the price of silver in terms of gold or the terms of gold into silver. As an example, the predominant gold coin of the Netherlands, a gold rider, was traditionally worth about 7 guilders, except that it could float up and down. And it was the same thing with the sovereign. It could float up and down against silver. So what the traders did was they would buy silver. They would buy gold with silver most of the time, and that way they could, by just exchanging one metal for another, get extremely rich. Spanish coins were, of course, still around, very much around. So in order to beat that sort of competition, the Dutch came up with several denominations and weight systems so that you could choose your favorite ones and you could still be with the same Dutch coins. Typical approach for a trader. The axis of the system was the Amsterdam Wisselbank, the Bank of Exchange. It was very dependent on the United East India Company. It traded in paper. In other words, you could come there and deposit your silver or gold. You would get a document in return. You could go to another country. You could use that document with a local sort of a bank. They would accept the document and give you coins instead. You didn't have to travel with the precious metal. And if the pirates or the robbers caught you, they could do nothing with the document because they needed the document needed a proof of identification to be validated. Wisselbank was so dependent on the United East India Company that when the United East India Company went bankrupt in 1794 during just pre-Napoleonic times, the Wisselbank went bankrupt as well. And then came Napoleonic occupation, ending the Dutch predominance in reserve currencies. Next, please. Here are some remnants of that period. The lion dollar is one of these coins that never circulated in the Netherlands. This one is marked GEL on the side with the knight holding the arms. You can see GEL at 10 and 11 o'clock, which means Gelderland, one of the provinces of the United Netherlands, but that is a mint mark. It is not an indication of where the coin circulated. This coin was especially popular in the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean. It was very badly struck. This is actually a very good copy, so that the climbing lion on the other side looked like a dog to the Ottomans, and the nickname of this coin was Abu Kalb, the father of the dog. Then there was the gold coin that made it possible to do the arbitrage in metals. Here you have a ducat 1736. It's actually a medieval coin that was imitated from the Duchy of, well, it wasn't Venice, but it was near there. And it kept into circulation until, hold on to your chair, 1960. That was because of an oversight in the law, but still you could legally pay with this coin. This coin was particularly popular in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. That was the reason why the coin was in circulation, was being minted also so long. because there was demand for it in Indonesia, which was until 1949 a Dutch colony. And then we have a real trading coin, a Rijksdaalder. That's a denomination that's existed until the euro was introduced. But here's one minted in 1683 in the province of Groningen. That one was very popular around the Baltic, Scandinavian countries, and it was much imitated there as well. And the last one, and that was really an important one for the existence of the Wisselbank, the Bank of Exchange, the Ducaton. This one is dated 1767. It was minted in Gelderland, and it was ignored by the Bank of Exchange in the sense that if you came with the Ducaton, it would be accepted, but then it would be converted by silver content into heavier coins, and it would be administrated as such. Next, please. Thank you, Shashwat. And here is familiar grounds for some of you, I suppose. We had John Law, a Scottish card player and banker. He was a card player before he was a banker. He escaped from a British prison after a duel when dueling was forbidden, and he dueled a bit too well and killed his opponent. But he escaped. He ended up in France. With gambling, he amassed a little fortune, which attracted the attention of the locals and especially the French king. He was able to start a bank. And again, being a gambler, he knew that not all the paper that you would issue, the paper money that you would issue, would be brought to the bank at the same time, as long as people trusted the money. And so he issued fiduciary paper, but the king, of course, was a bit less disciplined, and he thought that he could issue paper as well. Trust in paper was lost. The paper was devalued time and again. John Law was broke. This was a great lesson for Napoleon Bonaparte, who wanted to be anything except the French king. So he became an emperor rather than a king, and when he issued money, he wanted the money to be sound. And that sound money policy was reflected in the law of 7 Germinal of the year 11, which is a revolutionary date. That law said that the standard of the French currency would be the franc, and the 5 francs would be especially important. And anybody who changed with the silver content of the franc was an idiot. Well, Napoleon went, but the law remained on the books, and that led eventually to the Latin Monetary Union, which used the law of 7 Germinal 11 as its basic coin. Collectors of modern coins will notice that there is a great resemblance between, for instance, the Italian 5 lira coin, the Belgian 5 franc coin, the French 5 franc coin, the Swiss 5 franc coin, and so on and so forth. And there are even countries that were never a member of the Latin Monetary Union, but they still used the same standards, and their coins were accepted in exchange for the coins of any member of the Latin Monetary Union. And LMU coins could be used in any of the coins of the LMU. The weak point of the LMU was that it had a fixed silver to gold ratio. So the price of silver expressed in gold or vice versa was always the same. And market forces were a lot stronger than the Latin Monetary Union, because there were a number of gold rushes in Australia, in the United States, and in Canada at the time that undermined the system completely, which is the reason why the 5 franc coins of Switzerland, for instance, are so scarce. There were issued in very small numbers to escape from having to accept that they had to make the coins at a loss. Next, please. A couple of souvenirs of those times. You have an assignat of 1,000 francs here, which is worth probably less than the paper it was printed on, except of course to a collector. The assignat was a banknote. It failed completely with the other paper money, but an important lesson was learned, the lesson of solid money. And there is right next to it Napoleon's standard coin, the franc. And the guy on the coin is, of course, Napoleon himself. Funnily, in catalogs, he's always described as a naked Napoleon. I'm not quite sure where they got the rest of the body, but oh, right, that's a detail. The Latin Monetary Union's standard coin was the 5 franc rather than the 1 franc, because the 5 franc coin had to be in full, its worth in silver, more or less, whereas the 1 franc coin was a non-standard coin. And the coin of Venezuela shows you that the standards of the LMU could be used in a country that was not even a member of the LMU, in this case, Venezuela. Next, please. And that brings us to Britain. This was a country that was, in fact, to a large degree, a gold-based monetary system. And it had as one of its policy lines that its colonies were required to use British money. That didn't always work. In fact, it most of the time did not work. But it brought about a system that was sensitive to the risk of decolonization, because the whole British Empire rested on the fact that it had that colonial empire. And what if all those colonies wanted to be independent, just as happened to the Spanish colonies? Well, the countervailing part of that was political prestige. Because the British had this enormous integrated economy at their disposal, they were able to buy allies, and they did. This is why sovereigns and later were always acceptable. I mean, even in the Second World War, British pilots would have a few gold coins in their personal pack in order to be able to survive if they happened to be shot down, survived, and had to pay for getting out of an awkward situation. The British Empire was hyper-conservative, but it was also quite innovative. It liked sound money, but the sound money meant sound gold. And that meant that when it was involved in a war, like the First World War, for instance, when the war was ended, there had been a bout of inflation. The inflation was dealt with by enormous unemployment. The unemployment, again, led to high crime rates. The high crime rates led to enormous amounts of hangings. The whole thing was very unpleasant, but you can see the same thing happening in the Napoleonic Wars, the First World War, and even a little bit in the Second World War. The cost of the money was high. There was also a problem with the monetary system, which was non-decimal, a bit of an outlier, and therefore hard to calculate with. It is, in fact, the only the reason why the unit of account, which is the sovereign or the pound later, is the reserve currency. The lower coins were occasionally accepted, but it was basically the sovereign that was the unit, that was the coin that was accepted all over the world. So here we are with a fantastic economy, and it was completely destroyed in two world wars, followed by two economic crises that were self-imposed in an effort to keep the pound stable. And who was the successor? Well, we'll see that on the next slide, but first we're going to have a look at some more pictures. Next, please, Shashwat. Thank you. There it is. Your first picture is still a coin, and the coin is a tool of diplomats. You would equip your spies with coins. You would equip your diplomats with coins, and there wouldn't be much of a difference between spies and diplomats. It was an instrument for tax evasion. You could park your money somewhere else. It was also an inflation hedge. If a war was threatening, then you had a couple of those, and you could hide them in your mattresses, under your mattresses, in the ground, wherever. But they were a hedge against inflation. You could hoard them if you were afraid of the future of your own currency, as happened in South America very often, but also in some Mediterranean countries. And it is the last reserve coin. From here on, we'll see paper and other stuff. The paper, in fact, is the second picture. You see a banknote, British banknote that served as a traveler's check for the Grand Tour tourists. Don't know if you're familiar with the term. Among rich people, it was sort of a tradition to let the sons make an extended trip through other countries in order to make them aware of the rest of the world. They traveled in style and with lots of money, and that money would have been the paper money that you see here. And also, I have included a little graph because money is usually something tangible like the banknote and the coin. But from the graph, you see that in Britain, there was a pretty stable relation between the number of coins outstanding, or the amount of money outstanding, I should say, and GDP, which means that there was a pretty good basis between the two. Then during the Second World War, you see that it goes, the amount of pounds as a percentage of GDP goes up, which frankly did not mean that the pound was in demand more. It was more that the British economy was spending enormous amounts of money on armaments. After the Second World War, you see that the two lines cross. The budget, the domestic budget, is now more important than the demand from foreigners, and that percentage actually goes down to the level where it was in 1913 at the beginning of the graph. Next, please. And with the British no longer being able to live as they could before the First World War, we need a successor, and the successor was the United States. Its power did not rest on a colonial empire. It did have some colonies, but they weren't really all that important, Philippines, Hawaii. But it had it had constructed during the two world wars an enormous alliance that rested on shared values. Things like democracy, rule of law, but also Christianity. There were wars waged by the United States, but they never reached the shores of the United States. So it escaped the enormous destruction that occurred in the UK, for instance, during the Second World War. Then there was immigration, which added to the number of workers. An enormous amount of land, much of it had to be worked in order to become fertile, but it was possible. And so capital was formed at rapid pace. After the Second World War, the Allies were exhausted, except the United States, which was not really involved in the sense that war was waged within its borders, and that military dominance translated into a political dominance, such as NATO, where it was agreed that the commander-in-chief of NATO would always be an American. The alliance was kept for a long time because of the Cold War. The Allies were actually, and there again, the example is NATO, the Allies were resolved to help each other, and in that way they actually prevented an atomic war, which was a system that at the time was known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD, which it was. Liberal economic thought is another one of those shared values. You have Paul Samuelson, who is one of the great economists of my youth, and Friedman, the Chicago School, who found in favor of the British system of, in crisis, hold the money stable and don't worry about unemployment. And you get slowly that the Allies are drifting away. And at the same time, European Union is making new alliances, while also others are catching up. I think in the first place of Japan, but there's a second generation of Korea, Taiwan. A third generation is already coming up. Thailand is a good example. And I personally believe that India is third generation as well. Next, please. And here is the last banknote of the reserve currencies. This one was the banknote that the young lady in front of my hotel had in mind, though at the time it looked a little bit different. It was a banknote that was used for capital flight, black market, tax evasion, crimes, all negative things. Why? Because the real reserve was not this note. The real reserve was in T-bills. The 30-year T-bill interest rate, you can see on the graph here, gave banks, insurance companies, pension funds, institutional investors the liquidity in dollars that they needed. They never had any metal, but they could count this according to their legislation as money. The T-bills were also having other functions. Well, you can read them for yourself, so I won't read them for you, but aircraft is a good example. Even today, if you want an aircraft, and even if you buy it from Brazil, you'll have to pay in dollars. Next, please. Now, in 1960, 40% of the world GDP came from the US, and today that is down to 26%. That's not because the US is in crisis, that's because the others are catching up. In 1960, the US was the first world trader. It's now third after the European Union and China. If we look at all the other reserve currencies, they lasted each about 130 to 140 years. It's spectacularly standardized. And we now have a United States that is politically stagnant and out of touch, increasingly out of touch with allies. The shared values are falling apart. So what's going to happen to the dollar? Is it going to remain a reserve currency? Well, the first question is, what's the alternative? The euro is pretty bureaucratic. Its reserve system is not adequately arranged. In short, it's not flexible enough. In China, renminbi, sorry, but as long as people do not trust China, it's not going to be a reserve currency. And as long as not enough people trust it, others will not trust that they can buy and sell in renminbi. And therefore, I'm going to spend the last few seconds of what I wanted to say on the subject of the central bank digital currency. Next, please. The central bank digital currency is not Bitcoins. Bitcoins, the value of Bitcoins is based on nothing. It is just the trust that you think you may be able, or you will be able to find somebody who accepts them. A CBDC is underpinned by central bank. It's like having, instead of money, having an account with a central bank, and you can always draw on the account. All your money will be there, and it will be payable on demand, and you will have the electronic means to pay with it. You will not be carrying any money around. It may depend on your fingerprint, or it may depend on the iris, or it may depend on something else again. It may be face recognition. We don't know yet. But since you will have nothing to do, even with a bank, in order to spend, the banks will have one more or less role to play. And the question is, will there be any roles left to play for them? You will be able to spend your money anyway. Not much will change, except that thieves and robbers will have even less of a chance with you. Next, please. And you will have much more information on all of these subjects on World of Coins. Thank you all very much for your attention. I have been concentrating on the presentation, so I've seen that there were lots of comments in the chat. So let's scroll back a little bit. Where does it start? We have one more question for the previous speaker. And there's very famous Portuguese coins inspired very good imitations, says Luis Salgado. And he gives you the URL of a nice article on the imitations in Sweden and Finland. That's fun, of course, but I immediately have to add that there were also Russian and Polish imitations of Dutch gold coins. Peter Arian, how widely was the famous Maria Theresa thaler used? Well, the story of the Maria Theresa thaler is actually quite complicated as well as short. It was used mostly in Egypt, then in North Africa, then in the Middle East. And it came about because the supply of Dutch silver was cut off by the Napoleonic Wars. But quite quickly afterwards, the Maria Theresa thaler had to share its role as a reserve currency with the British pounds, and they became more popular in Arabic countries. They still are very popular there. And so the Maria Theresa thaler had actually a rather limited role. It did survive in the lower parts of Africa for quite some time, especially in the Horn. But that was probably more like due to the isolation of that part of the world than to having a real trade role.